The first attack I investigated happened in the Sierra Nevada foothills, 30 miles east of Sacramento, where a retired ranger was found dead in his cabin with the door torn off its hinges and claw marks gouged 8 feet up the interior walls. The marks were not from a bear. They were too narrow, too deliberate, and arranged in patterns that suggested fingers rather than paws. The coroner ruled it a wild animal attack, but the photos I took before the body was moved showed something else entirely. Defensive wounds covered both arms, deep lacerations that had caught fur and tissue samples. When the lab results came back 3 weeks later, they were marked, classified, and removed from the database. I kept copies. The DNA was canine but carried markers that didn't match any known species in the system. That was in March of 2023, and it was the beginning of what would become the worst 8 months of my career. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I spent 14 years with the Bureau before this case landed on my desk. Most of it focused on organized crime and interstate fugitives. I knew how to track human predators, how to read crime scenes, how to separate fact from panic. When the Sacramento field office received a request for assistance from the Placer County Sheriff's Department, I expected the usual jurisdictional mess over a drug operation or maybe a serial offender crossing state lines. Instead, I got a case file that read like something from a Gothic novel. 7 separate incidents over 6 months, all within a 90-mile radius of Lake Tahoe. Livestock mutilations that went beyond predation into something that looked ritualistic. Hikers reporting encounters with an upright creature covered in dark fur that moved too fast to photograph. Campsites destroyed with a level of violence that suggested rage rather than hunger. The local authorities were overwhelmed and looking for any explanation that didn't involve acknowledging what the evidence was showing them. They wanted the FBI to either solve it quietly or declare it a hoax so they could move on. The Bureau assigned me because I had worked animal attack cases before, back when I was stationed in Montana and dealing with the aftermath of grisly encounters gone wrong. They thought I could handle the physical evidence without flinching and provide a rational assessment that would close the file with minimal fuss. They were wrong about the second part. I drove up to Forest Hill on a Tuesday morning in late March, following Highway 49 through gold rush country where the trees grew thick and the cellular signal died in patches. The sheriff met me at a diner on the edge of town, a man in his late 50s with deep lines around his eyes and a handshake that lasted a second too long, as if he needed the contact to confirm I was real. He didn't want to talk in his office. He didn't want anyone hearing what he had to say. We sat in a corner booth with coffee neither of us touched while he laid out what had been happening in his county. His voice was low and careful, the words chosen with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in his head multiple times but still couldn't quite believe he was having it. He told me he had been sheriff for 22 years and had seen every kind of crime and tragedy that a rural county could produce: bar fights and domestic disputes, drug labs and illegal grows, traffic fatalities and hunting accidents. But nothing in his experience prepared him for what started happening in the fall of the previous year. The first incident was in October of the previous year, when a hunting party found their camp torn apart while they were away checking trap lines. Tents shredded, supplies scattered across 100 yards, and their truck pushed off the logging road into a ravine. They assumed vandals or maybe a territorial dispute with another hunting group until they found the tracks. Barefoot impressions in the mud near the creek, 18 inches long and showing 5 toes with claw tips extending an inch beyond the pad. The front part of the print looked human. The back part looked canine. The stride length measured over 6 feet. They took photos and filed a report that went nowhere because no one knew what to do with it. The sheriff showed me the photos on his phone, grainy images taken in poor light that nonetheless showed the impossible anatomy clearly. He told me the hunters were experienced outdoorsmen, men who had spent decades in these mountains and knew the difference between human and animal sign. They weren't the type to panic or fabricate stories. They left the area immediately and refused to return, abandoning thousands of dollars worth of equipment rather than spend another night in that location. Similar incidents followed through the winter, each one escalating in severity and spreading across a wider geographic area. A ranch outside Auburn lost 12 head of cattle in a single night, killed but not eaten, arranged in a rough circle in the middle of a pasture. The rancher found them at dawn, each animal showing massive trauma to the neck and chest, but with minimal blood loss, as if they had been killed elsewhere and moved to this location. The circle was precise, each carcass equidistant from the center, positioned with a deliberation that went beyond any natural predator behavior. The rancher had worked cattle for 40 years and had dealt with mountain lions and bears and every natural predator in the region. He told the responding deputies this was different, this was wrong, in a way that made his skin crawl. He showed them tracks leading from the pasture into the tree line, the same impossible prints the hunters had photographed. The deputies took photos and filed a report that mentioned possible cult activity or ritualistic vandalism. They never went back to interview the rancher again, and he never reported another incident, despite telling his neighbors he saw something watching his property from the forest edge on multiple occasions after that night. A construction crew working on a Forest Service road found their equipment vandalized and a storage trailer ripped open from the top down, the metal peeled back like a sardine can. The damage would have required industrial equipment or multiple people working with cutting torches, but the site was 15 miles from the nearest road access and showed no evidence of vehicle entry. The crew foreman found tracks in the clearing around the trailer, the same distinctive prints pressed deep into hard-packed earth that should not have held impressions from anything short of heavy machinery. Then came the encounters with people, incidents that moved beyond property damage into direct confrontation. A woman driving home from her night shift at a hospital in Grass Valley hit something on a dark stretch of road and stopped to check for damage. She got out of her car and found herself facing a shape that stood upright between the trees, taller than a man, with eyes that reflected her headlights in a greenish glow. She described it as having a wolf's head on a human body, covered in fur the color of dried blood. It watched her for perhaps 10 seconds without moving, without making a sound, just standing there with its arms hanging at its sides in a posture that was disturbingly human. Then it dropped to all fours and vanished into the forest with a speed she couldn't process, covering what looked like 30 feet in a single bound before disappearing completely. She drove to the nearest gas station and called the police from there, too shaken to drive any farther. She kept repeating that the eyes looked intelligent, that it wasn't watching her the way an animal watches, it was studying her the way a person studies something they're trying to understand. The responding deputy found scratches on her hood deep enough to expose the metal underneath, 4 parallel gouges spaced like fingers. He filed a report that mentioned a possible wildlife encounter and left it at that. But he told the sheriff later that the scratches were wrong, that no claw marks he had ever seen showed that kind of spacing or depth. When I read through the case files in the sheriff's office later that afternoon, I saw a pattern the local deputies had either missed or chosen to ignore. Every incident happened within 10 miles of the same geographic feature, a stretch of old-growth forest along the North Fork of the American River that had been protected from logging since the 1960s. The attacks were escalating in frequency and severity, moving from property damage to livestock killings, to direct confrontations with humans. Something in that forest was territorial and getting bolder, testing boundaries and showing increasing willingness to engage with human presence. I spent the next 3 days interviewing witnesses and collecting physical evidence that the local authorities had either stored improperly or ignored entirely. The retired ranger's cabin became my focus. His name was on the lease, but not on any of the reports because he had been dead for 2 weeks before anyone found him. He lived alone, kept to himself, worked part-time as a consultant for the Forest Service, advising on trail maintenance and wildlife management. The only reason anyone checked on him was because his mail had piled up, and a concerned neighbor finally called the sheriff. The scene was a nightmare of violence that spoke to rage rather than hunger. The front door had been ripped off its hinges with enough force to splinter the frame and send the door flying 12 feet into the yard. Claw marks covered the walls inside, some so deep they exposed the studs beneath the plaster, running in parallel lines that suggested systematic destruction rather than random thrashing. Furniture was overturned and destroyed, not just knocked over but systematically broken, as if something had taken time to ensure nothing remained intact. Chairs were reduced to splinters, a table was cracked down the middle, shelving units were torn from the walls. The body was in the bedroom, partially hidden under a collapsed bookshelf that had been pulled down on top of him, possibly in a final attempt to create some barrier between himself and whatever had entered his home. The coroner's report noted massive trauma consistent with a large predator attack, but the specifics didn't match any known animal behavior. The wounds were too clean, too precise, arranged in patterns that suggested controlled strikes rather than the random mauling a bear or mountain lion would inflict. They looked deliberate, almost surgical in their placement, targeting major muscle groups and vital areas with accuracy that went beyond instinctive predation. I photographed everything before the cleanup crew arrived, documenting angles and measurements that the initial responders had overlooked. I took samples from the claw marks, scraping wood fibers and residue that might contain biological material. I collected fur caught in the defensive wounds on the victim's arms, carefully preserving each sample in separate evidence bags with proper chain of custody documentation. The samples went to the FBI lab in Quantico with a priority flag and strict instructions for discretion. I knew even then that the results would be problematic, that whatever truth emerged from the analysis would complicate rather than clarify. While I waited for results, I interviewed the neighbor who had found the body, an older woman who had lived in the area for 40 years and knew the forest better than most. She lived a quarter-mile down the road in a cabin similar to the victim's, surrounded by the same dense forest and same isolation. She was reluctant to talk at first, giving me the standard responses about how the victim was a quiet man who minded his own business and never caused trouble. But when I asked her directly if she had ever seen anything unusual in the woods, something changed in her expression. The professional distance dropped and I saw genuine fear surface, the kind of fear that comes from personal experience rather than abstract worry. She looked at me for a long moment, weighing whether to trust me with what she knew, and then she started talking. She told me about sounds she heard at night, howls that started low and rose to a pitch that made her teeth ache and her windows vibrate in their frames. Not wolf howls, not coyote yips, but something that combined both and added a resonance she felt in her chest more than heard with her ears. She told me about finding deer carcasses hung in trees, suspended 8 feet off the ground with no obvious means of getting them there, gutted and arranged with their heads facing west. She told me about a morning she went out to collect firewood and found a circle of stones arranged in her driveway, each one the size of a bowling ball, placed with geometric precision while she slept. 23 stones in a perfect circle, each one carried from the creek bed 100 yards away, positioned overnight without making enough noise to wake her or her dogs. She walked around that circle 3 times before she worked up the courage to disturb it, and when she finally moved the stones back to the creek, she felt like she was being watched from the forest the entire time. She told me about tracks she had seen, the same impossible tracks with human and canine features, appearing in her garden after heavy rain and following the perimeter of her property in a pattern that suggested deliberate patrol rather than random passage. She asked me if I believed in things that weren't supposed to exist, things that operated outside normal understanding of the natural world. I told her I believed in evidence, that I followed where the facts led regardless of how uncomfortable the destination. She laughed at that, a sound without humor, and said evidence was what got her neighbor killed. She said he had been collecting information, taking photos, trying to document what he was seeing in the forest. She said he had talked about going public with his findings, about contacting researchers or journalists who might take the situation seriously. 2 weeks later, he was dead, torn apart in his own home by something the authorities refused to acknowledge existed. The lab results arrived by secure courier on a Friday afternoon, sealed in an envelope marked for my eyes, only with classification levels that seemed excessive for a routine wildlife analysis. The DNA analysis confirmed the samples were canine, but with chromosomal abnormalities that the technician noted as potentially resulting from contamination or degradation. The report suggested the samples might have come from a hybrid species, possibly a wolf-dog crossbreed with unusual genetic markers introduced through deliberate breeding programs. It was a safe conclusion that checked all the boxes for a rational explanation, something that could be filed and forgotten without raising uncomfortable questions. I didn't believe it for a second. The samples were fresh, collected from open wounds less than an hour after death, stored properly and transported under controlled conditions. There was no degradation, no contamination, no reasonable explanation for the abnormalities beyond the obvious one that no one wanted to acknowledge. And the technician's notes, buried in the appendix of the report where most people would never read them, mentioned specific anomalies in the genetic structure that didn't match any known canine species in the database, domestic or wild. Markers that suggested an evolutionary divergence from known canine lines that should have happened millions of years ago, but somehow persisted into the present. The technician had been careful not to draw conclusions, sticking to dry technical language and avoiding speculation, but the implications were clear if you knew what to look for. Someone at Quantico had made a decision to classify the findings and bury the details under language that sounded conclusive without actually explaining anything. I made copies of everything, the full report including the technical appendices, and stored them off-site in 3 separate locations. 3 days later, the original files were pulled from the system with a directive that came from above my supervisor's level. The case was being closed, the evidence was being transferred to a different jurisdiction, and my involvement was terminated effective immediately. That's when I knew this case was going to destroy my career one way or another. Because I couldn't let it go and the Bureau couldn't afford to let me continue, I requested authorization to conduct field surveillance in the protected forest area where the incidents were concentrated, knowing the request would probably be denied, but needing to make the attempt through official channels before I acted independently. My supervisor denied it twice, citing budget constraints and lack of probable cause, before finally agreeing to a limited operation with strict parameters and no official record. He made it clear this was a courtesy to close out the case file with something more substantial than a desk review, not an endorsement of any alternative theories about what was happening in those woods. He gave me 1 week, a basic field kit pulled from storage, and instructions to submit a final report that would satisfy the locals and allow everyone to move on to more pressing matters. I took a team of 2 junior agents who were green enough not to ask too many questions and professional enough to document everything properly. Both were recent academy graduates, eager to prove themselves, not yet jaded enough to ignore evidence that contradicted official positions. I briefed them on what to expect, showed them the photos and the preliminary reports, and watched their expressions shift from skepticism to concern as they processed what they were seeing. We established a base camp at an abandoned fire lookout tower 5 miles from the last known incident site, a structure that gave us elevation advantage and clear sightlines across the surrounding forest. The tower had been decommissioned in the 80s when satellite monitoring made human lookouts obsolete, but it was still structurally sound and offered protection from ground-level threats. We brought motion-activated cameras, night vision equipment, audio recording gear, and enough supplies to maintain surveillance for 7 days without resupply. We began systematic monitoring of game trails and water sources in the area, setting up camera stations at strategic locations and reviewing footage every 6 hours. The first 3 nights were quiet in the way that felt wrong. Too quiet, with none of the normal nocturnal activity you expect in healthy forest ecosystem. We logged minimal wildlife movement, no deer browsing patterns, no small mammal activity in the areas where we had set our cameras. It was as if everything with survival instincts had abandoned this section of forest, leaving it empty except for us. We documented standard territorial markers from local black bear and mountain lion populations on the periphery of our surveillance area, but nothing ventured into the core zone we were monitoring. The forest felt dead, or more accurately, it felt like something was keeping everything else out. On the 4th night, everything changed. We were in the tower, taking turns on watch while the others tried to sleep, when the sound began. It started as a low rumble that I felt in my chest before I actually heard it, a subsonic frequency that made the wooden floor of the tower vibrate beneath my feet. Then it rose, building in volume and pitch until it became a howl that didn't match anything in my experience or in any wildlife audio database I had studied during my years with the Bureau. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote, wasn't any canine vocalization I had encountered in 14 years of fieldwork across multiple states and ecosystems. It was deeper, more resonant, with a quality that seemed almost intentional, as if something was shaping the sound rather than simply producing it. The howl lasted perhaps 15 seconds, reaching a peak that made the windows of the tower rattle before cutting off abruptly in a silence that felt like physical pressure. In the silence that followed, every normal forest sound stopped completely. No insects chirping, no birds calling, no small mammals rustling through the underbrush in their nocturnal routines. Just silence so absolute it felt oppressive, unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. One of the junior agents, barely 25 and fresh out of the academy with top marks in practical scenarios but zero real field experience, asked me what we should do. I could hear the fear in his voice, that edge of panic that comes when training meets reality and reality proves to be nothing like the simulations. I told him to keep his weapon holstered and his flashlight off, that we were here to observe and document, not to engage. We sat in the dark of the tower and waited, and the sounds that came next were somehow worse than the howl. Movement through the forest, heavy and purposeful, breaking branches that sounded too thick to break naturally, and displacing earth with footfalls that carried up to our position despite the distance and the intervening vegetation. The pattern was wrong for any four-legged animal. 2 steps, pause, 2 steps, pause. Bipedal movement, deliberate and measured, as if whatever was out there was searching for something or testing the area for threats. It circled our position for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, based on the timestamps we reviewed later on our equipment. The movement stayed just beyond the range of our night vision equipment, in that zone where we could hear everything but see nothing. We could hear it breathing, deep exhalations that sounded almost like sighs or deliberate attempts to catch our scent on the air. The junior agents were frozen, hands on their weapons despite my instructions, barely breathing themselves. Then, as abruptly as it began, the presence withdrew, moving away through the forest with a speed that defied the size suggested by the sounds. Whatever it was covered ground faster than any large predator should move through dense forest at night, and within minutes the normal sounds of the forest resumed gradually. Insects first, then small mammals, then birds, beginning their pre-dawn calls. In the morning we found tracks. The impressions were clear in the soft earth near a creek bed, 200 yards from our tower, preserved in mud that had dried overnight into a perfect geological record of what had passed through. I measured them carefully while the junior agents took photographs from every angle with proper scale references and multiple lighting conditions. 18 inches long, showing 5 distinct toes, with claw marks extending an inch beyond the primary pad. The front section looked human, with an arch and toe spacing that suggested a primate structure, possibly even showing the vestigial evidence of a flexible midfoot that no known canine possessed. The back section looked canine, with an elongated heel and pad configuration that matched a wolf's hind foot, but scaled up to proportions that shouldn't exist in any living species. The stride length measured 6.5 feet, calculated by measuring multiple consecutive prints and accounting for terrain variations. Whatever had left these tracks was walking fully upright and stood at least 7 feet tall when vertical, possibly taller if it moved with any crouch or bend in its posture. We cast the prints using dental plaster from our evidence kit, working carefully to capture every detail, including the depth variations that would show weight distribution and gait mechanics. We collected soil samples from the depression points, documenting everything with the kind of forensic precision that would satisfy even the most skeptical laboratory review or courtroom presentation. The junior agents were quiet as we worked, the easy confidence and academic swagger of the first 3 days replaced by something that looked a lot like fear and awe combined. They understood now that this was real, that they were documenting something that shouldn't exist according to everything they had learned in training. When we finished the evidence collection, I told them we were breaking camp and returning to base immediately. Neither of them argued. Neither of them wanted to spend another night in that forest. The casts and samples went to the lab with another priority flag and another request for discretion, though by this point I knew how that request would be received and what would happen to the results. I wrote a preliminary report that documented the physical evidence without drawing conclusions about what had created it, sticking to measurable facts and observable phenomena without speculation. My supervisor called me into his office the day after I submitted it, the report sitting on his desk with notes scribbled in the margins and certain passages highlighted in yellow. He closed the door before speaking, which was never a good sign, and asked me directly what I thought we were dealing with. His tone was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the edge of his desk. I told him the truth because lying would have been pointless at that stage. The evidence suggested an unknown bipedal predator with both human and canine characteristics, operating in a protected wilderness area with increasing aggression toward human presence, and demonstrating intelligence that went beyond normal predator behavior. I told him the attacks were going to continue and escalate unless we took action to either identify and contain the threat or close the area to public access until we understood what we were dealing with. I told him we needed to bring in specialists, wildlife biologists, and physical anthropologists and geneticists who could analyze what we had found without the institutional bias that prevented law enforcement from seeing it clearly. He listened without interrupting, his expression neutral and controlled, the face of a career bureaucrat who had heard too many impossible things and learned to process them all the same way. When I finished, he opened a drawer in his desk and removed a file that had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for this exact conversation. He slid it across to me and told me to read it before I said anything else, before I committed to any position that would end my career. The file was thick, perhaps 200 pages, and marked with classification stamps that indicated multiple levels of restricted access. The file contained reports from 19 different field offices spanning 40 years, all documenting similar incidents in remote wilderness areas across the western United States. Wyoming and Montana, Idaho and Washington, Oregon and Nevada, and of course California, with more reports than any other state. Sightings of upright canine creatures ranging from 7 to 9 feet tall, covered in fur varying from black to brown to reddish tones. Attacks on livestock that showed the same patterns I had documented, precise targeting of major muscle groups and vital organs, suggesting intelligence rather than instinct. Attacks on humans that were rare but devastating when they occurred, showing the same controlled violence and deliberate methodology. Physical evidence that was either lost through mishandling, misidentified through institutional bias, or classified and removed from public record. Every investigation had been closed with inconclusive findings or attributed to known predators, despite evidence that clearly contradicted those conclusions. Every agent who had pushed for further investigation had either been reassigned to different duties, convinced to drop the matter through various forms of pressure, or in a few cases forced into early retirement when they refused to accept the official narrative. The pattern was clear and damning. The Bureau knew these creatures existed, they had known for decades, and they had made a deliberate institutional decision to suppress that knowledge and discredit anyone who tried to bring it to public attention. My supervisor watched me read through the file, watched my expression change as I processed the implications. When I finally looked up, he explained the Bureau's position in language that was diplomatic but firm. These incidents represented misidentifications of known wildlife, isolated cases of exotic pet releases gone wrong, or in some cases elaborate hoaxes perpetrated by attention seekers or people trying to boost tourism in rural areas. There was no unknown predator species operating across multiple states. There was no systematic threat to public safety. There was only a collection of unrelated events that happened to share some superficial similarities when viewed through the distorting lens of sensationalism and superstition. He told me to close my case file with the same conclusion and move on to other work where my skills could be better utilized. I refused. Not immediately, not in his office where refusing a direct order would have ended my career on the spot and potentially exposed me to charges of insubordination, but gradually through a series of small acts of resistance that allowed me to continue working the case without official authorization. I used vacation time and personal days to conduct additional fieldwork, driving back up to the Sierra Nevada foothills and spending days hiking through the protected forest area where the incidents were concentrated. I contacted retired agents who had worked similar cases decades earlier and were willing to talk off the record now that their careers were over and they had nothing left to lose. They told me stories that paralleled my own experience, investigations that were shut down, evidence that disappeared, superiors who made it clear that certain conclusions were unacceptable, regardless of what the facts suggested. I built a network of civilian witnesses who were documenting encounters in real time and sharing information through private channels, online forums, and social media groups where people felt safe discussing experiences that would get them dismissed as crazy in public settings. What I learned over the next 4 months was that these attacks were not isolated incidents but part of a pattern that stretched back decades and possibly centuries, woven into the fabric of American wilderness experience in ways most people never recognized. Indigenous tribes in the region had stories about creatures they called by various names, skinwalkers and wendigo, and other terms that translated roughly to shapeshifters or spirit animals. Beings that combined human intelligence with animal fury, that walked the line between worlds and defied easy categorization. Early settlers in the 1800s reported encounters with wolf-like beings that walked upright and demonstrated behavior too complex for natural predators. Incidents that were recorded in journals and letters but dismissed as frontier tall tales, or misidentifications of bears standing on hind legs. Modern sightings accelerated in the 1970s and 80s as development pushed deeper into wilderness areas that had been relatively undisturbed since before European contact. Human populations encroached on territories that had been stable for generations, and the creatures responded to that pressure with increasing defensive aggression. The creatures were territorial in ways that went beyond normal predator behavior. They marked boundaries with physical signs that researchers had documented, but consistently misinterpreted as natural phenomena. Trees stripped of bark in patterns too regular to be random. Stones arranged in geometric configurations near water sources and game trails. Skeletal remains of prey animals displayed in ways that suggested intentional messaging rather than simple caching for later consumption. They avoided confrontation when possible, melting back into deep forest when human presence became too persistent or intrusive, but when pressed, when cornered, or when their territory was violated in ways they found intolerable, they were capable of extreme violence delivered with precision that suggested intelligence and planning. They were smart enough to avoid trail cameras by detecting the infrared triggers or electromagnetic signatures the devices emitted. They were clever enough to disable equipment left in their territory, systematically destroying surveillance gear and research instruments with targeted damage that went beyond random vandalism. And they were spreading, or perhaps more accurately, they were being pushed into new territories as old habitat became untenable due to logging and development and recreational use. Reports that had once been concentrated in a few remote wilderness areas were now appearing across a much wider geographic range, following corridors of remaining old-growth forest and protected wilderness that provided the isolation these creatures needed to survive. The pattern suggested a species under pressure, adapting to changing conditions and in some cases failing to adapt fast enough. In July, 3 hikers disappeared in the Tahoe National Forest during a weekend backpacking trip. They were experienced outdoors enthusiasts, all 3 with years of wilderness experience and proper equipment. They filed a route plan with the ranger station and checked in by satellite phone on their first night out. The call on the second night never came. Search and rescue teams found their camp torn apart, tents shredded and scattered across 50 yards, gear broken and abandoned. Blood evidence indicated violent trauma, arterial spray patterns on trees and rocks suggesting catastrophic wounds inflicted with extreme force. But no bodies were recovered despite an extensive search that lasted 2 weeks and involved over 100 personnel combing the area. The official report concluded they had probably been attacked by a bear, standard language that covered any wildlife incident where details were uncertain. The reasoning was that the bear had dragged their remains into the forest, where scavengers finished the job. A plausible explanation that satisfied the need for closure without requiring uncomfortable questions. I drove up to the site before the area was cleared, spending 6 hours documenting what the search teams had missed because they weren't looking for it. Claw marks on trees at heights no bear could reach, 8 and 9 feet up on trunks that showed the same narrow, deliberate gouges I had seen in the ranger's cabin. Tracks that showed bipedal movement around the perimeter of the camp, circling multiple times before converging on the tent locations. Personal belongings arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence, rather than random scattering. Items like wallets and phones placed in a row on a flat rock as if sorted or examined. I took everything I found and added it to my growing collection of unofficial evidence, documentation that existed outside any official channel and would never see the inside of a courtroom or laboratory. By August, I had documentation on 47 separate incidents spanning 6 states, all sharing the same characteristics, all officially explained away or buried under administrative red tape and institutional reluctance to acknowledge something outside the accepted framework of reality. I knew I was running out of time. The Bureau was losing patience with my continued interest in a case they considered closed, and my supervisor had made it clear through increasingly direct conversations that my next assignment would be as far from California as possible if I didn't drop the matter immediately. Transfer to a field office in the Midwest or the Deep South, somewhere I couldn't continue this investigation even if I wanted to. The message was clear. Let it go or lose everything I had worked 14 years to build. But I couldn't let it go because people were dying, and no one was doing anything to stop it. The official position was that these were random wildlife encounters, tragic but unavoidable incidents that occasionally occurred when humans ventured into wild spaces. The reality was that we were dealing with an intelligent predator that was being pushed into conflict by habitat loss and human encroachment, and every incident that went unexplained brought us closer to a catastrophic encounter that would force acknowledgement in ways that would be far more damaging than honest assessment of the situation now. I tried to make that argument through official channels, through carefully worded memos and data-driven presentations. I was told my concerns had been noted, and my recommendations would be taken under advisement, bureaucratic language that meant nothing would change. The final incident happened in October, almost exactly 1 year after the first reported case in the area that had started my investigation. A family camping near French Meadows Reservoir, a popular recreation area that should have been safe, was attacked in their tent during the night. The father survived long enough to give a statement to the first responders before dying from his injuries in the helicopter during medical evacuation. He described a creature that stood upright on 2 legs, covered in dark brown fur that looked black in the moonlight, filtering through their tent. He said it had torn through the tent fabric like paper, just reached out with hands that looked almost human except for the claws and ripped the nylon from top to bottom in one smooth motion. He said it grabbed his wife before he could react, dragged her out of the tent while she screamed, and disappeared into the darkness with her in less than 5 seconds. He tried to fight it off with a camping hatchet, the only weapon he had within reach, and managed to wound it on the arm or shoulder before it threw him against a tree hard enough to break his spine and collapse his left lung. His wife and 2 children, ages 7 and 9, were never found. Searchers combed the area for weeks, deploying dogs and helicopters and ground teams that covered every square yard of forest within a 5-mile radius. They turned up nothing except blood evidence and more of those impossible tracks, leading away from the campsite in a direction that went deeper into wilderness, where even experienced search teams struggled to operate. The case made national news for about 3 days, featured on cable news and discussed on social media before being eclipsed by other stories and fading into the background noise of modern media's attention cycle. The official conclusion was bear attack, despite all the evidence to the contrary, despite the eyewitness testimony from the victim, despite everything I had documented over the previous 8 months. I was pulled off all active cases and placed on administrative leave pending a review of my conduct during the investigation, a procedure that was officially about ensuring proper protocols, but was actually about forcing me to recant my conclusions or resign. My supervisor told me I was being given a chance to reconsider my findings and submit a revised report that aligned with the Bureau's position, that acknowledged the possibility of misidentification and alternative explanations for the evidence I had collected. He made it clear this was my last opportunity to salvage my career, that if I continued pushing this narrative I would be terminated and likely face difficulty finding employment in law enforcement anywhere in the country. The implication was explicit: fall in line or be destroyed. I told him I would think about it, bought myself a few days to consider my options, but I knew there was no real choice. I couldn't revise the report to say something I knew was false. I couldn't dismiss evidence I had collected and documented with my own hands. And I couldn't continue working for an institution that valued political convenience over truth and public safety. I never submitted that revision. Instead, I resigned from the FBI in November of 2023, 16 years into a career that had defined my adult life and given me purpose and identity. I could have fought the administrative pressure through the grievance process, could have filed complaints and pushed back through official channels and union representation. But I knew how that story ended from watching it play out with other agents who had challenged institutional positions. The evidence would disappear through mysterious administrative errors. My reputation would be systematically destroyed through selective leaks and strategic character assassination. The attacks would continue while everyone pretended they weren't happening, and I would be cast as the unstable agent who couldn't accept reality. So instead, I took everything I had collected, all the reports and photos and physical samples and witness testimony, and I stored them in 3 separate locations where they couldn't be easily confiscated or destroyed through a single action. I contacted a few journalists I trusted, reporters who had done serious investigative work and weren't afraid of controversial stories. I gave them copies of the key documents, knowing they would face the same skepticism and institutional resistance I had encountered, but hoping that sheer volume of evidence might eventually shift the narrative. Most of them looked at the material, did some preliminary research, and ultimately decided the story was too risky to their credibility to pursue. One reporter actually filed a story that ran in a regional paper, but it was positioned as a human interest piece about rural folklore rather than a serious investigation, and it generated no follow-up or broader interest. And I moved to a small town in Northern California where I could monitor the situation without drawing official attention, establishing a baseline existence that would allow me to continue tracking incidents while staying below the radar of anyone who might want to silence me more permanently. I still track the incidents. They're still happening. Roughly 1 every 6 to 8 weeks across California and neighboring states. Always in remote wilderness areas where official response can be delayed and evidence can be more easily controlled or dismissed. Always officially explained as something mundane, bear attacks or mountain lion encounters, or in some cases simply as unexplained disappearances that might be voluntary flight or foul play. The pattern is clear to anyone willing to see it, anyone willing to look past the convenient explanations and examine the underlying evidence. But most people aren't willing. They prefer the comfort of known frameworks, even when those frameworks require ignoring most of the available data. What I know now, after 2 years of research and fieldwork that exists outside any official capacity, is that the creature people call Dogman is real. It's not a myth, not a case of mistaken identity, not a hoax perpetrated by attention seekers. It's a biological entity that has survived in North American wilderness for centuries by avoiding human contact and maintaining territories in areas too remote for regular human presence. The recent increase in encounters is a direct result of habitat loss and human encroachment pushing deeper into the remaining wilderness. As we fragment and consume the last wild places, we force these creatures into defensive positions where conflict becomes inevitable rather than occasional. They're not monsters in the supernatural sense. They're predators, responding to perceived threats to their territory and their survival with the tools evolution gave them. But they're also intelligent enough to be unpredictable and strong enough to be deadly. The combination makes them perhaps the most dangerous species humans share the continent with, and our refusal to acknowledge their existence makes that danger exponentially worse. The attacks will continue as long as we pretend they don't exist. People will keep dying in incidents that get classified as bear attacks or unexplained disappearances. Evidence will keep being suppressed or explained away through institutional mechanisms designed to maintain comfortable fictions. And the creatures will keep adapting, learning, and moving into new territories as their old ones become uninhabitable. I've accepted that I can't stop this pattern single-handedly. The institutional resistance is too strong, and the cultural taboo against acknowledging unknown species is too deeply embedded in how we think about the natural world. But I can document what's happening with precision that might someday force accountability. I can warn people who are willing to listen, sharing information through channels that bypass official gatekeepers. And I can maintain the archive of evidence that might someday force a reckoning with the truth when the cost of denial finally exceeds the cost of acknowledgement. The most recent incident I'm tracking happened 2 weeks ago near Shasta Lake in Northern California, where a bow hunter encountered one of these creatures at close range and lived to describe it in detail that matched every other credible report I had documented. He was setting up a tree stand at dawn, working alone in an area he had hunted for 15 years without incident, when he heard movement below him in the understory. Looking down, he saw a shape moving through the ferns and low branches on 2 legs, roughly 7 feet tall and covered in reddish-brown fur that caught the early light. It stopped directly beneath his position, stood completely still for a moment as if sensing something, and then looked up at him with eyes that he described as disturbingly human in their intelligence and awareness. They watched each other for what he estimated was 30 seconds, though time distortion under stress makes that measurement uncertain. The creature didn't show aggression or fear, just studied him with what looked like curiosity mixed with something else he couldn't quite identify, assessment maybe, or calculation. Then it turned and walked away on 2 legs with a gait that looked almost casual, moving through dense forest without apparent effort, covering ground with a smooth efficiency that suggested perfect familiarity with the terrain. He climbed down from the tree immediately, not waiting to complete his setup, not considering the hunt or the equipment or anything except getting away from that location as fast as possible. He left his tree stand, his bow, his pack, with supplies worth hundreds of dollars, just abandoned everything, and hiked back to his truck at a pace that was almost running. He filed a report with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife from the parking area, his hands still shaking as he typed on his phone, describing what he had seen before the memory could be rationalized away or dismissed as imagination. The report was marked as a possible black bear sighting, standard procedure for any large animal encounter that doesn't fit clear categories, and filed away in a database where it would never be connected to the pattern of similar reports. I interviewed him 3 days later at his home, recording the conversation with his permission and documenting his account in detail that would satisfy forensic standards. He showed me photos he had taken on his phone after the encounter, returning to the site later that day with a friend for support, clear track impressions in soft mud beneath where his tree stand had been positioned, showing the distinctive anatomy I had seen in multiple locations across 2 years. 18-inch prints with the hybrid characteristics that marked these creatures as something outside known taxonomy. He asked me what he should do, whether he should go back and try to get more evidence, set up cameras, or collect samples that might prove what he saw. I told him to stay away from that area indefinitely and consider himself lucky to have survived the encounter without injury or trauma. I explained that the creatures are becoming less afraid of humans, more willing to show themselves in daylight hours, more aggressive in defending territories that are shrinking under development pressure. That shift worries me more than anything else I've observed over 2 years. It suggests desperation, a species being pushed to the point where normal avoidance behavior breaks down and confrontation becomes more likely. When apex predators stop avoiding humans, when they start viewing us as threats that need to be dealt with rather than avoided, the casualty rate accelerates in ways that become impossible to suppress or explain away. I've spent the last 2 years trying to understand these creatures beyond just documenting their attacks and cataloging evidence. I've consulted with cryptozoologists who have been studying similar phenomena for decades, serious researchers who approach unknown species with scientific methodology rather than sensationalism. I've spoken with wildlife biologists who work in remote areas and have encountered things they can't explain through conventional understanding of animal behavior and ecology. I've reviewed historical accounts from explorers and settlers, studied indigenous folklore and oral histories, traced the pattern back through centuries of recorded human experience in North American wilderness. What emerges from all this research is a picture of a species that has existed alongside humans for millennia, but has remained largely hidden through a combination of natural camouflage, considerable intelligence, and deliberate avoidance behavior that kept them separate from human populations. Even as those populations expanded, they're most likely a remnant population of an ancient canine species that developed bipedal locomotion and increased brain size through evolutionary pressures we can only speculate about, possibly related to extinct dire wolves that disappeared from the fossil record 11,000 years ago, but with adaptations that allowed a small population to survive in isolated pockets of wilderness where they remained undetected by developing human civilization. They're pack animals with complex social structures that mirror both wolf-pack dynamics and primate social organization, showing cooperation and communication that goes well beyond simple pack hunting behavior. They communicate through vocalizations that range from wolf-like howls to sounds that researchers have compared to human speech patterns, complex vocalizations with tonal variations that suggest linguistic structure, though no one has successfully documented or translated any consistent language or meaning system. They hunt both as individuals and in coordinated groups, showing strategic thinking that goes beyond basic predator instinct. Evidence from multiple attack sites suggests they can plan ambushes, coordinate movements to cut off escape routes, and adapt tactics based on prey behavior in ways that require abstract thinking and mental modeling. And they have a deep aversion to human technology, particularly cameras and recording devices, possibly detecting electromagnetic signatures or infrared triggers that we barely understand ourselves. This explains why clear photographic evidence remains frustratingly scarce despite hundreds of reported sightings over decades. They can sense our surveillance attempts and avoid them with precision that suggests sensory capabilities beyond what we typically associate with canine species. The question I get asked most often when people learn about my research and my background with the Bureau is why I think the government is covering up evidence of these creatures. The answer is more complicated and more mundane than most conspiracy theories would suggest. I don't believe there's a centralized directive from some shadowy agency to suppress information about unknown species. I don't think there's a secret committee meeting in underground bunkers deciding which evidence to release and which to bury. What I've seen is much more ordinary and in some ways more frustrating. It's institutional inertia, combined with career protection, combined with a fundamental unwillingness to acknowledge something that doesn't fit existing frameworks and would require massive restructuring of how we think about wilderness management and public safety. Acknowledging that an unknown predator species exists in populated areas, that it's intelligent and dangerous and capable of killing humans, would require enormous resource allocation. Federal and state agencies would need to completely rethink how they manage public lands. Warning systems would need to be established. Access restrictions would need to be implemented. The liability exposure would be catastrophic for agencies that allowed public access to areas where they knew these creatures operated. Lawsuits from families of victims would bankrupt park systems and force closure of recreational areas that generate billions in economic activity. So the path of least resistance is to classify each incident individually, explain it through known factors like bear attacks or mountain lion encounters, and move on without acknowledging any larger pattern. Individual agents and scientists who push back, who try to force acknowledgement of evidence that contradicts official narratives, get sidelined through career mechanisms that are subtle but effective. Bad performance reviews, assignment to undesirable positions, denial of promotion opportunities, eventually forced retirement or resignation when the pressure becomes unbearable. Evidence that contradicts the official narrative gets lost through administrative procedures, misplaced during transfers, destroyed during facility upgrades, or simply reclassified to levels where access becomes so restricted that effective research becomes impossible. And the pattern continues because everyone involved has professional incentives to maintain the status quo, even when that status quo is demonstrably false and people are dying because of that falseness. I maintain contact with a network of about 30 people across the western states who are actively monitoring and documenting these encounters with varying levels of sophistication and success. We share information through encrypted channels and maintain our own database of incidents that would never make it into official records. documentation that exists in parallel to official reporting systems, but never intersects with them. Most of these people are civilians, outdoors enthusiasts, and rural residents who have had their own experiences and can no longer accept the official explanations for what they've witnessed. A few are current or former law enforcement who work within their jurisdictions to document evidence while being extremely careful not to draw the kind of attention that ended my career or worse. Together, we've compiled what I believe is the most comprehensive record of Dogman activity in North America, tracking over 300 separate incidents with varying levels of documentation quality, but all meeting minimum standards of credibility. The pattern shows a species under enormous pressure, pushed into increasingly marginal habitat by human development and climate change, responding to human presence with escalating defensive aggression as their territory options narrow. The attacks are not random predation. They're not motivated by hunger or opportunistic feeding. They're defensive responses concentrated in areas where human development has recently expanded, where resource extraction has disrupted traditional territories, where recreational use has increased beyond what the creatures can tolerate while maintaining their isolation. The creatures are not seeking out humans to attack. They're defending space they consider their own against intruders they view as existential threats to their survival. Understanding that distinction is critical to predicting where future incidents will occur and potentially mitigating the conflict before it escalates to the point where suppression becomes impossible and public acknowledgement becomes inevitable. The physical evidence I've collected over 2 years would fill a small warehouse if it were all consolidated in one location. Plaster casts of tracks from 17 different locations across California and Nevada, hair samples that have been analyzed by private laboratories and returned results inconsistent with any known species in their databases. Audio recordings of vocalizations that acoustic experts cannot match to existing animal calls in North American fauna. Photographs of claw marks and territorial markers that show consistent patterns across hundreds of miles and multiple years. Video footage from trail cameras that captured shadows and movement, but never clear images, always just enough to document presence, but not enough to satisfy scientific standards of proof. Documentation of hundreds of witness accounts from credible observers, including law enforcement officers, military veterans with combat experience, experienced hunters with decades of wilderness time, and long-term wilderness residents who know the difference between normal and abnormal wildlife behavior. None of this evidence has been accepted by mainstream science or law enforcement because it exists outside official channels and challenges fundamental assumptions about what species do and don't exist in North American wilderness. The skepticism I encounter when presenting this evidence used to frustrate me deeply. Now I understand it as a necessary psychological defense mechanism. Accepting this evidence would require accepting that we don't have complete knowledge of the natural world, that dangerous unknowns exist in places we thought were completely mapped and understood, that our institutions have failed to protect people from a documented and predictable threat. That's a lot of cognitive dissonance to process, and most people would rather dismiss the evidence as flawed or fraudulent than confront those uncomfortable implications about the limits of human knowledge and institutional competence. I returned to the Sierra Nevada foothills last month, driving the same roads I traveled 18 months ago when this investigation first consumed my life and destroyed my career. I parked near the trailhead where the retired ranger used to access his cabin, now marked with a memorial plaque that mentions his years of service but nothing about how he died. I hiked into the forest with nothing but a backpack containing basic camping gear, water, food, and my documentation equipment. I wasn't looking for new evidence this time. I wasn't trying to document anything specific or build a case that would convince skeptics. I just needed to be in that space again, to reconnect with the place where this all began, to see if I could still feel the presence that had driven my investigation forward, despite all the institutional resistance and personal cost. The cabin is gone now, demolished by the county months after the attack, and the land returned to Forest Service management. But the clearing where it stood remains visible, marked by a depression in the earth where the foundation was, and scattered stones that once formed the fireplace. Pine needles had covered most of the site, nature reclaiming the space with efficient speed. I made camp in that clearing as the sun went down, built a small fire from deadfall, and waited for night to fully settle. The sound started around midnight, the same deep howls I had heard from the fire lookout tower during my official investigation, echoing through the valleys and ridges with that distinctive resonance that had no match in any wildlife database. They were closer this time, much closer, maybe a quarter mile away at most, calling and answering in a pattern that clearly suggested communication rather than random vocalization, tones rising and falling in sequences that implied meaning and response. I sat by my fire and listened without fear, without the adrenaline response that had marked my earlier encounters. I thought about all the people who had died in incidents, officially explained as something else, families destroyed by violence that was never properly acknowledged or investigated. I thought about the creatures themselves, intelligent beings driven to the edge of viable habitat and responding the only way evolution had equipped them to respond. The howling continued until just before dawn, when it stopped as abruptly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, I heard movement in the forest around my position, branches breaking under heavy weight and earth shifting under deliberate footfalls. Something large was circling my camp, staying just beyond the firelight, but making no effort to hide its presence. I could hear it breathing, deep and steady exhalations that carried across the clearing. I could feel it watching me, assessing, deciding. It circled 3 complete times and then stopped, holding position somewhere in the darkness to my left. I spoke then, not because I expected it to understand human speech, but because silence felt like an insult to the moment. I told it I wasn't a threat, that I had come to understand not to hunt. I told it the forest was its territory, and I would leave at first light. I don't know if it understood my words, but something in my tone must have registered because, after a long pause, the footfalls resumed, moving away through the forest with that supernatural speed these creatures possess, fading into distance and leaving me alone in the clearing. When the sun came up, I broke camp methodically and followed a game trail to where the creature had been standing during its circuit. The tracks were clear in the morning frost, 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and extended claws, the same impossible anatomy I had documented in a dozen other locations. I took a photograph from my records and then covered the tracks with forest debris, a small gesture of respect for something that had chosen to leave me alive when it easily could have done otherwise. That's when I understood fully what I had learned over 2 years of obsessive investigation and personal sacrifice. These creatures aren't monsters. They're survivors, adapting to a world that has no room for them anymore, responding to threats the only way they can. And we're the ones who will decide whether they survive the next century, whether through acknowledgement and careful coexistence, or through continued denial until human expansion leaves them nowhere to go and conflict becomes inevitable. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing. For more interesting stories, check this out.